An important question naturally follows. What is the very first object of human communication? Or, to put it more precisely, what is the first psychological need that communication is built around? One of the most influential answers comes from a series of famous experiments conducted by psychologist Harry Harlow using infant rhesus monkeys. These studies are often referred to as the cloth mother experiments, and they fundamentally changed the way psychologists think about early emotional development. Harlow divided the infant monkeys into 3 groups. The first group was raised naturally by their biological mothers. The second group was raised in complete isolation, without any maternal contact. The third group experienced something very different. Instead of a real mother, the infants were given an artificial substitute. But Harlow asked an important question. What kind of substitute could replace a mother? Researchers experimented with different models. Some were made of wire. Others were built from cardboard or other rigid materials. What they discovered surprised many people. The newborn monkeys consistently preferred a very specific kind of artificial mother, not the one that simply existed nearby. Not even the one that provided food. They chose the one covered in soft cloth, a surface that felt warm, gentle, and comforting. This became known as the cloth mother. The conclusion was profound. The infant's first psychological need is not simply nourishment. It is physical sensory contact, warmth, touch, comfort, emotional security. These experiments suggested that the earliest foundation of communication begins not with language, but with emotional attachment. Physical closeness and emotional connection become the child's first experience of relationships. When researchers compared the development of the 3 groups, the differences became clear. The monkeys raised by their biological mothers developed most successfully. That result was expected. The infants raised in complete sensory isolation experienced severe developmental delays. That too was not surprising, but the third group, the infants raised with the cloth mother, produced the most interesting findings. Their development fell somewhere between the other 2 groups. The cloth mother provided comfort. She reduced fear. She created emotional security. But she was still only a substitute. As the young monkeys grew older, something fascinating happened. They gradually explored farther and farther away from their cloth mother. Yet every so often, they returned. They briefly touched the soft fabric, held on to it, and then continued exploring the world. Later studies reached an even more interesting conclusion. The older the infant became, the farther it was willing to travel before returning. In other words, emotional security did not prevent exploration. It made exploration possible. This leads to one of the most important psychological insights. A mother is not only the source of emotional attachment, she also becomes the child's first gateway to the outside world. A secure emotional bond gives the child confidence to explore what is unfamiliar. Without that secure base, curiosity becomes much more difficult. Harlow's experiments also produced one unexpected finding. At first, the cloth mother appeared remarkably successful. But as time passed, the monkeys raised with the artificial mother began falling behind. Not only behind those raised by real mothers, which everyone expected. In some areas, they even fell behind animals raised in complete isolation. Why would that happen? The answer turned out to be remarkably important. A real mother does much more than provide comfort. She actively encourages exploration. She responds, moves, interacts, guides. She gently pushes the infant toward discovering the surrounding world. The cloth mother could offer emotional reassurance, but she remained passive. She never encouraged curiosity. She never invited interaction with the environment. She could comfort the infant. She could not help the infant grow. Harlow's conclusion reaches far beyond his laboratory. Sometimes the very thing that supports development at one stage can begin to limit development at the next. Early in life, the mother is the child's entire world. But healthy development requires that this world gradually expand. A real parent does not simply protect the child from the environment. A real parent gradually introduces the child to it. When this transition does not happen, emotional care can slowly become emotional overprotection. And overprotection, despite being motivated by love, may eventually interfere with healthy psychological development. This is one of the central lessons of developmental psychology. Children need both a secure place to return to and the freedom to leave it. Only together do those two experiences allow healthy emotional and cognitive growth. As development continues, we cannot hope to describe every stage of a child's growing need for communication in a single lecture. Those topics belong to developmental psychology and deserve much deeper discussion. For now, we will move forward to the next major step. The child's world begins to expand, and the next social environment the child enters is the family. This is where classical psychoanalysis offers one of its most influential ideas. Freud described what he called the family triad. The family triad consists of three psychological positions. One position belongs to the child, the developing self. The other two are occupied by the mother and the father. The first and perhaps most important point is remarkably simple. Healthy psychological and social development depends on the presence of all three positions within this structure. Why is this so important? Because these early relationships become the child's first models for understanding other people. They provide the earliest framework for understanding what it means to relate to men and women, authority and care, independence and attachment. These experiences become reference points for future social life. If one of these positions is absent or cannot be psychologically integrated, the child's internal picture of relationships may become incomplete. This does not mean that children from single-parent families are destined for poor outcomes. Human development is far more complex than that. What matters is the availability of stable, emotionally meaningful relationships that allow the child to build reliable internal models of trust, care, and identity. Developmental psychologists often observe similar questions in children who grow up in institutional settings, such as orphanages or long-term residential care. One common finding is that the child's image of a parent may initially become very broad and undefined. Almost any caring adult may temporarily occupy that psychological role. At first, this flexibility has an obvious advantage. The child remains open to forming new emotional bonds. There is hope. There is trust. There is still the expectation that someone may eventually become a true parental figure. But if no stable attachment develops over time, this openness can gradually change. Repeated disappointment often leads to withdrawal. The child begins to stop expecting reliable relationships. Trust becomes more difficult. Emotional distance becomes a form of protection. What first appeared as openness may eventually become social isolation. This brings us back to Freud. He argued that the family is far more than a place where a child grows up. It is the environment in which personality begins to take shape. It is the first stage on which emotional life is organized. For Freud, the family triad was not simply a description of household structure. It was the psychological foundation upon which later relationships would be built. This is why he believed that early family relationships deserve such careful attention. Not because childhood determines everything, but because the earliest emotional patterns often become the templates through which later experiences are understood. In other words, the family is both an opportunity for healthy development and, in some cases, the source of psychological conflicts that continue into adult life. Understanding those early patterns does not mean becoming trapped by them. It means recognizing where they came from. Only then can a person begin to build relationships based on present reality rather than unconscious repetition of the past. Freud believed that as children continue to develop, their emotional world becomes more complex. Communication is no longer centered only on comfort and security. Gradually, the child begins to recognize differences between people and to form unique emotional bonds with each parent. This is where Freud introduced one of the most discussed and often misunderstood ideas in psychology: the Oedipus complex. Today, the term is frequently used in popular culture, often without understanding what Freud actually meant. He was not describing conscious romantic feelings in the adult sense. Rather, he was describing a developmental stage during which a child is learning about attachment, identity, and family relationships. For a young boy, the mother often becomes the primary source of affection and emotional security. Naturally, he wants her attention. He wants to be close to her. At the same time, the father begins to appear as someone who also occupies an important place in the mother's life. From the child's perspective, this can create emotional tension, not because the child consciously wishes to compete with the father, but because he has not yet learned how multiple close relationships can exist at the same time. Freud believed this conflict is eventually resolved through identification. Rather than competing with the father, the boy gradually begins to identify with him. He imitates him, learns from him, adopts his behavior, values, and social role. In doing so, the father changes from a perceived rival into a model for adulthood. Freud described a parallel process for girls, traditionally called the Electra complex, although that specific term was introduced later by Carl Jung rather than Freud himself. The underlying principle is similar. The child gradually shifts from exclusive attachment toward identification with the same-sex parent. From a modern psychological perspective, many of Freud's specific explanations remain controversial. However, one of his central insights continues to influence developmental psychology. Children do not simply learn by being taught. They also learn by identifying with significant adults. Much of personality develops through observation. Children absorb patterns of behavior long before they are capable of explaining them. They notice how parents solve problems, how they argue, how they apologize, how they express affection, how they respond to fear, disappointment, or success. These observations become part of the child's internal psychological world. This is one reason psychologists often say that children learn more from what parents do than from what parents say. Values are not transmitted only through instruction. They are transmitted through everyday behavior. Freud argued that the successful resolution of these early developmental conflicts allows the child to move toward greater psychological independence. The goal is not to remain emotionally dependent on the parents, nor is it to reject them. Healthy development means gradually forming one's own identity while preserving the capacity for close relationships. In that sense, growing up is not the disappearance of attachment. It is the transformation of attachment into maturity. Freud's ideas eventually inspired many other psychologists, but few expanded them as creatively as Carl Jung. Jung agreed that our earliest relationships leave lasting impressions on personality. However, he believed those influences extend far beyond childhood. According to Jung, every man carries an unconscious image of the feminine within his own psyche. He called this inner image the anima. Likewise, every woman carries an unconscious image of the masculine. He called this the animus. These are not conscious beliefs. They are deep psychological patterns that gradually develop through experience. Where do they come from? Their earliest foundations are often laid in childhood. A boy's first experience of femininity usually comes through his relationship with his mother and the important women around him. A girl's first experience of masculinity often develops through her relationship with her father and the significant men in her life. Of course, these are not the only influences. Teachers, relatives, friends, culture, and later relationships all contribute to these inner images. But the family provides the first framework. Jung believed these unconscious images continue to influence us throughout adult life. They shape what feels familiar, what feels trustworthy, what feels attractive. Sometimes people say, "I don't know why I'm drawn to this person," or "I can't explain it, but something about them feels right." Jung would suggest that these reactions are rarely accidental. Often, we respond not only to the real person standing in front of us, but also to the unconscious image we have carried for many years. This does not mean we literally search for someone identical to our mother or father. That would be an oversimplification. Instead, we tend to recognize familiar emotional patterns. Certain qualities feel comfortable because they resonate with experiences that helped shape our personality. Other qualities may feel strangely unsettling for exactly the same reason. This helps explain why relationships can sometimes feel instantly natural or unexpectedly difficult. The other person may be awakening psychological patterns that were formed long before either of you met. Jung believed that becoming psychologically mature requires recognizing these unconscious influences. Otherwise, we risk confusing our inner expectations with reality. Instead of seeing another person as they truly are, we may see only the image we have unconsciously projected onto them. In that sense, adulthood is not simply about finding the right partner. It is also about learning to recognize the invisible psychological patterns we bring into every relationship. The better we understand those patterns, the more freely we are able to choose. Without that awareness, we often repeat the same emotional stories over and over again, believing each time that the circumstances are entirely new. Jung's central message was optimistic. The past undoubtedly shapes us, but it does not have to imprison us. The purpose of psychology is not to erase childhood. It is to understand it well enough that we are no longer controlled by it. Only then can our relationships become genuine encounters between two real people, rather than unconscious repetitions of experiences that began many years earlier. If we step back and look at these different theories together, an important picture begins to emerge. Harlow emphasized the importance of emotional attachment. Freud focused on the psychological dynamics within the family. Jung explored the unconscious patterns that continue to influence us throughout adulthood. These theories differ in many respects, but they all point toward a similar conclusion. The earliest relationships in life matter, not because they permanently determine our future, but because they provide the first psychological framework through which we begin to understand ourselves and other people. It is tempting to think that personality develops only through conscious decisions we make as adults. Developmental psychology suggests otherwise. Long before we are capable of deliberate reflection, we are already learning. We are learning what safety feels like, what trust feels like, what closeness feels like, how conflicts are resolved, how affection is expressed, how people respond to disappointment, fear, success, and loss. These experiences become part of our internal psychological world. Much of this learning takes place silently. Children rarely analyze it. They simply absorb it. This is why early family relationships can have such remarkable influence later in life. Not because they dictate our future, but because they become the starting point from which future experiences are interpreted. Fortunately, psychology does not stop there. Neither Freud nor Jung believed that people are condemned to endlessly repeat childhood patterns. Awareness changes everything. The moment we recognize an unconscious pattern, we gain the opportunity to examine it rather than simply live it. This is one of the central purposes of psychological knowledge. Not to blame parents, not to assign guilt, not to explain every difficulty through childhood. Its purpose is understanding. When we understand where our expectations, fears, and relationship patterns come from, we become less controlled by them. That understanding creates freedom. Perhaps this is the most important lesson of all. Parents undoubtedly influence a child's future, sometimes more than they realize. But influence is not destiny. Childhood writes the first chapters of our psychological story. It does not write the final one. As adults, we have the ability to continue that story consciously. And that may be the greatest achievement of human development. We cannot choose where our story begins, but we can decide how it continues.